first contemplated doing the book that became Hometown Asylum was the history of the way in which we've treated those of us with mental disorders over time. And I've always been fascinated by the different kinds of treatment that have taken place in the history of institutional mental health. I obviously grew up in Ponoka and had a major institution for mental health, the Alberta Hospital Ponoka, right on my doorstep more or less. My father and many others who worked at the hospital, we lived on the street that only was separated by a wood and the golf course from the hospital itself in the Riverside. We were in the Riverside part of town. I started specifically when I was wondering about what a post-retirement project might look like. I began to reflect on the meaning of the word asylum, and in contrast to some of the connotations we now have about asylum that obviously have been sifted through the lens of movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And it struck me rather forcefully that the original sense of the word asylum and its literal meaning is that of an inviolable place, a place of sanctuary, a place of refuge, a place of protection. And with an emphasis, if you will, not on active treatment, but on simply ensuring the safety of people. It then occurred to me that in a way, a hometown itself is a kind of asylum. Certainly for those of us who have grown up in small communities, in my case, the town of Ponoka, we feel that it's where we belong. It's where we fit in. Even now, after being away from Ponoka for many years, while I taught at Simon Fraser University, the University of Western Ontario, I still, when I come back to visit relatives and old friends, I feel like I belong here. I feel a sense of safety here. I feel that it's a place of asylum, a place of sanctuary where I can be the person that I think I am. So the title Hometown Asylum was selected. I chose it because it connotes to me both a kind of ideal for a hospital care and treatment center for people with mental disorders. It has this sense of belonging to a hometown or to a community. When I retired in 2018 from the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University, where I had been teaching predominantly history and theory of psychology, by the time I had retired, I had built up quite a large portfolio of information and material, not only about psychology in general, but about mental health in particular. Students seemed very interested in the history of psychiatry as well as psychology. And over the years, I began to sprinkle my lectures with more and more information about both psychiatry and psychotherapy, as well as scientific research, psychology in different areas.
But there was a lot of unruly behavior, and sometimes straitjackets were used, but there was often people that were so depressed that they were suicidal. And these people were usually put in side rooms, where side room was an isolated room with a heavy door and just bars on the window, a bed, and that was really about all in the room. But if they were suicidal and threatening to kill themselves, we had to do suicide watch, and that meant you must check that patient every 15 minutes at least and record their behavior at that time. Medication time was another very interesting time in that just about every patient received some form of medication, mostly psychotropic drugs, Largacto for schizophrenia, Tofranil, Xanax for depression, and lithium was on the scene then to treat bipolar disorder, and in those days we called it manic depressive disorder. So when it was medication time, they would come to the medication room one at a time, and many patients hated taking those drugs. They didn't think it was helping them, but they thought, some of them thought it was poison. But we had to watch, well, everybody really, but particularly the people that we knew didn't want to swallow their drugs. And we actually had to get a tongue depressor and look into their mouth and lift their tongue so that we didn't find the drugs under their tongue or in their cheek. And we termed that as cheeking their medications. So we wouldn't let them leave until they actually swallowed their medications.
Electroshock was given on the men's wards and the women's wards on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And what happened was that person that was depressed or really very difficult to manage would have anywhere up to 30, we called it ECT, the electroconvulsive therapy. And they would come in, and the doctor would, of course, talk to them a bit, and then they'd be asked to lay on a stretcher. And they would lay on the stretcher. We have 3 staff on each side holding on to them, and they would get a 1/6 of a volt for about less than 2 seconds, and that would put them into a convulsion. So we would take a hold of their arms, of their legs, we at the bottom of their feet, both ankles, and as the head nurse, we had a dreadful job. We had to put a rubber piece in their mouth to keep them from biting their tongue.
I remember a couple of young men in particular who were so psychotic, you know, when they arrived, and their families were so distressed. And when I was here, we were still working with what was called the first generation of antipsychotics, Largacto or chlorpromazine, methyltrimeprazine. Other people will remember those. They were very effective. They weren't as effective as our second and even third generation antipsychotics, which have fewer side effects, like Abilify. I wish we could see what Abilify could have done for those people. But even then, the difference that they made and the focused teamwork on getting them, you know, back on track, back with their families and their communities, it was exciting. And to see them when they left, you think, yes, you're improved, but some of them I had the opportunity to see them, you know, I don't know, just in town or maybe at a future hospitalization in Red Deer, and they were so much improved, you know, just with the kind of assistance that they were getting with time and the medication and with the teams that they were working with.
It has this sense of belonging to a hometown or to a community. And in the case of the hospital, it throughout most of its history was an entire community unto itself, replete with all kinds of services and stores and happenings and recreational opportunities, much like you would find in any community. So it was one community that a lot of townspeople were associated with, either as patients or as staff. And then you have this other community that is right on its doorstep, the community of Ponoka itself. So I wanted to play with the idea of community in both a therapeutic institutional treatment context and also in the context of the broader interaction with the community of Ponoka and the hospital itself.
Early 50s and on into the 60s, there was a graduate nurse called Alice Moore. And he was concerned that the patients at that time were not able to be aware of what was going on in the world so much. So he arranged to have an hourly bus service every Saturday to town for the patients. So the bus would pick up the patients at Heritage, and they would go down and get off the bus at the IGA store. The manager in the IGA was very kind, and so they not only bought things in the IGA, but they got to know the staff there. And you'd be curious to what sort of things they buy.
Patient care improved in that there was a stronger push, I would say continual push, a continual encouragement to have patients live in an environment that was supportive. They were encouraged to keep in contact with their family or friends outside. There was things like get-togethers here for patients, like barbecues and social events. Our rec therapists, we had about 3 of them, I think. They were terrific in organizing recreational activities and arranging for groups to come in with sing-songs, like a local band. Sometimes there were physical activities like playing some ball, floor hockey. There used to be tennis courts just down the hill here and stuff like that. Patients, they would work really hard at trying to develop the skills they would need and the ability to go back to the community. We need to understand patients in those years might have been here for 20 years. And so how do they reintegrate into a very changed community? And that was part of it, to introduce them to things like they would go on a little trip to the city to see things and stuff like that. Very active. We hired a home economist to work with patients so they could relearn for some of the basics around managing their food, cooking, that kind of stuff. They were encouraged to do some of their own occupational therapy activities. We had a very good occupational therapy department, and for some they learned to do things that they hadn't learned before in an attempt so they could integrate back into the community. There was always this concept of looking ahead. What does the person need to be able to be successful in the community? And look at programs to do that. People that would have their loved one comes into our psychogeriatric unit, they would say, "Oh, this place provides such wonderful care to people."
We had a lot of work activities within the hospital where patients looked after all the livestock, chickens, pigs, cows, and then eventually we had patients that went into the community helping farmers. They were clearing land, they would pick roots, they would pick rock, and a couple of farmers had patients stay right at the farm, and I provided follow-up to them on the farms.
So received unsupervised parole, so he could go anywhere on the grounds or even into the town or wherever he wanted to go unsupervised, because everybody knew he would come back. He had nowhere else to go. And so when I brought student nurses there, he really enjoyed interacting with students. And he would go to the town of Panuca, buy ice cream and cookies, and bring them back for the students as a treat. And they loved that, and he enjoyed that. And he trusted me because he wrote, he gave me his his memoir, his handwritten memoir about his belief in the hospital and who was worthy of working there and who wasn't. I think he was quite paranoid at the same time. But he gave me his handwritten memoir.
When the hospital started in 1911, it was a small facility intended for a small group of patients numbering around 150. And it began using an approach that had been pioneered at that time and prior to it, toward the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, an approach called moral treatment. And the hospital was situated in a country setting on purpose, pastoral setting. It had lovely gardens, places where staff and patients could walk, talk together. It had recreational facilities, soccer pitches, and eventually softball playing fields and soccer playing fields. The idea was to care for people and to treat them with kindness as much as was possible, given that sometimes when we're struggling with mental disorders, we can it's sometimes difficult to control ourselves, and others have to come in and sometimes help to do that. But there was as little restraint as possible exercised in the early days of the hospital. There were almost as many staff as there were patients, so it was possible to provide attention, individual attention and conversation to patients. There was relaxation in warm baths, in recreational contexts, in silent walks alone or with others. So the whole focus was on getting away from stressful situations, encouraging relaxation and recovery, and trying to normalize the experience of the patients as much as possible.
Canadian Mental Health Association, as far as I was concerned, were just great. They helped us with our camping. A local fellow flew us around the central Alberta looking for a camping site, and eventually we found a place at Chain Lakes, and the Mental Health Association, bless them, they purchased the property for us. It took us quite a while to track down the owner, and they purchased the property, and we developed a camping program which went on for 2 or 3 years.
Well, the camping we had it at Glen Eden, which once again Bill Kinnear organized, and wards would go out for the weekend for camping, and they loved to go. We had to have a medical order from the physician. He had to say yes, they could go overnight, and it was very, very popular. Earlier on in the 70s, we had read about pub therapy, and I wrote to all the breweries in the province asking them if they had some extra sort of things that a pub would have. And Carling O'Keefe in Calgary at the Calgary Brewery responded, and they gave us enough wine and beer for about 3 years following, free. It was wonderful.
Around Jasper, Banff, and the medical superintendent was quite concerned about that maybe when we ate in the main dining rooms, their behavior would not be acceptable. But it turned out that up at Banff, we went into the School of Fine Arts. They served us family style, and the men, they all sat down accordingly. Please pass this, please pass that. And they were thoroughly gentlemen, shall I say. That was a surprise in one sense compared to what they had at the hospital. Another time we went to Banff, and we were on a tour at I think it was Johnson's Canyon overnight. And one of the patients, the men became quite amorous during the night and went knocking on staff doors wanting to come in, and it did upset one young lady, but the doctor with us calmed things down and told her that he was going to Europe and would bring her back a gift, and that everything would be okay. And it did turn out quite well. That was one incident we kind of had to cope with.
So by the time you're into the 1920s, there's tremendous overcrowding at the hospital, and funding for mental health has dried up. So there's a flip-flop now that from this model of moral treatment, basically staff and patients find themselves in a situation where the hospital is offering predominantly custodial care. There's much more emphasis on constraining violent behavior. More of the patients that are admitted, given that there are so many people that need to receive treatment, but there are so few beds, the treatment tends to be harsher for patients who are more violent and more difficult who are struggling with self-control, and in many cases are acting out. And so by the 1930s, the hospital is beginning to experiment with various kinds of physically invasive procedures that sometimes seem as much intended to punish patients as to help them. But the treatments here range from a variety of shock therapies, including the injection of malaria for fever treatments, malaria virus, including the inducing of seizures and comas through the injection of materials like drugs like metrazole and insulin, and into psychosurgeries, lobotomies that involve drilling small holes in the heads of patients and severing nerve connections between the frontal lobe and other areas of the brain. Not surprisingly, these treatments typically make patients more quiescent, easy to manage, but often at the cost of enduring difficulties that are brought about in their mental functioning by the treatments themselves.
Many years later, when I was teaching nursing at Red Deer College, because of my mental health background, my psychiatric nurse background, I would take busloads of students doing their basic RN program to Ponoka Hospital for their psych experience. And so they had classes there and some clinical experience, but there was one gentleman there who, he and his father had been admitted many years before. And these were two farmers, and they were selling their garden produce with their horse and wagon on the streets of Bashaw, a small town in Alberta, and many other areas. But they'd also preach the gospel on the streets to anyone who would listen. And they were termed mentally ill, so they both were committed or involuntarily admitted to Alberta Hospital and spent their life there, really. The father died, and the son got quite proficient at cutting hair. So he would cut most of the hair of the male staff and sometimes the doctors. And after his haircut, everybody stopped and waited for his behavior, because he'd kiss the man on the back of his neck after he cut their hair. And that was his signature.
I just had one patient for about a year and a half, and that patient had a leucotomy or lobotomy, and you had to re-educate that person, and that took a lot of patience, understanding what you were trying to accomplish for this fellow. I don't know, I just treated a patient like anyone else. They were individuals, and they had a lot to offer. I learned a lot.
And when he was in his early 20s in Butte, Montana, somehow he obtained a weapon of a gun or a rifle. I don't know which. And what he did was he was in Butte and was on a street, and a policeman and a pedestrian came walking by. And Alex thought that they were there to get him. And so he shot the policeman and the innocent pedestrian that was beside him. And after a number of months, he was sent back to Alberta, to the Alberta hospital, under the pleasure of the king, which meant that he couldn't leave that hospital for any good reason unless something had happened in the meantime. And when he came to our hospital, he was very hostile, very difficult, and so he was put on a ward called Green Court, and this ward was a unit where the people were there there had been some kind of crime committed, and it was known as the forensic unit. Alex indicated that he would like to learn to draw. So what Miss Chrysler did, she arranged for him to have a set of paints. And what they would use for him to paint on was the back of shoeboxes. Shoeboxes were fairly heavy cardboard, and so he started painting on that. And he did that right pretty well to the end of his career at the hospital. I felt that he was trying to describe his life in a sense, especially one that was a series of opening steps and doors, that this was his life, and that this was not a very pleasant one, in the sense that there didn't seem to be any end to it. And another one, when it looks like a rock on an ocean, and when I see that, I think of it that's sort of Alex's soul, just all alone with not a whole lot of support. But there was a painter on the unit, and the painter was painting the walls, and he was working away, and then I gathered that he decided that he needed to go to the washroom, and the only washrooms were available were the ones that the patients used. So he went off to the washroom. What he did, though, was he left his hammer. A hammer. Why he had a hammer, nobody really knew. And out with his painting equipment. Alex saw that. And when the painter came back in the room, he hit him over the head with the hammer, and the gentleman passed away.
The war years were especially hard in the 1940s, in that there was a real shortage of staff. There's many personnel at the hospital, doctors and nurses and others enrolled in one way or another in the armed forces. And the hospital was really on an emergency footing. But it was a very interesting time. almost of necessity, the hospital staff needed to rely on more patient involvement and assistance in work, given staff shortages. And the hospital, even in the midst of all the difficulties of wartime, seemed to make a bit of a transition to include more occupational therapy, more recreational therapy, more group discussion, as well as continuing some of the more physically invasive treatments.
The other thing that we tried to do, we tried to bring things that patients would help them for their own health. We had an absolutely fabulous director of nursing, Mary Apt, who always was outside of the box and always willing to try new things. And so one of the things I started was a jogging group. So the town of Ponoka, there was a store called Shillington, and they sold to the patients nice sneakers, and so every noon I would run around. I would meet the group, anybody who wanted to jog with me went around the hospital grounds, starting at Heritage. So we'd be out for about sometimes a half an hour, sometimes 3/4. It depended on how many patients joined us. But there was hardly ever less than 5 or 6. So we'd be running across, and there was at one time when there was a dog following us, and staff in the Hopewell block were really concerned that it was a bear. And here it was, one of the doctor's dogs running behind us. The thing that happened that was so important, that patients were not only patients, they became people.
We had groups going on every unit of some kind, the patient councils where the patients could raise concerns. We don't like fish on Fridays or whatever it was, and they would have the person from dietary sitting there listening to them, what they wanted. We want us to have a TV on this room or whatever. So they would be patient councils where they would raise, the patients themselves would raise what they wanted and try to accommodate them.
The real change in treatment occurred in the 1950s with the onset of seemingly effective treatment by psychopharmaceuticals. So this is a time by the mid-1950s at the Ponoka Hospital and elsewhere, you have drugs like Thorazine for the treatment of psychosis, and drugs like lithium for the treatment of mania. I could give you other examples. So there seemed to be at this point a potential chemical cure in the form of drugs that if patients were able to take them consistently and adjustments could be made given their reactions to the drugs, that that created a context in which patients no longer, most patients at least, required physical constraints. Side rooms began to disappear. Day passes became more common for patients who were doing well on their drug regimens. They would go into town. They would return to their families, return to their original communities for periods of times and trial bases. If things went well, they would transition into group homes that were becoming available in the 1960s.
Again, before tranquilizers came in, I remember quite vividly a patient came in, was very disturbed, and it took 2 or 3 staff to handle him. And so he was sent to a ward where he could be handled. And within 3 or 4 weeks, he was ready for discharge, and I happened to be at his discharge conference. And Dr. Mickey, the medical superintendent, asked him, "What changed since you've been in hospital? You're ready to go home." And he looked at the doctors and said, "You really want to know?" They said, "Yes." He said, "Well, there was a young doctor that came in every morning when he was making rounds, and he would say, 'Good morning,' and he meant it. Whereas you guys come along and just say 'good morning' and mutter it and continue on. But this young doctor meant it was a good morning. And he said that's when I started to improve."
I had some wonderful, wonderful friends in the hospital, and I remember when I first went there, there was a wonderful young woman the same age as me, whose name was Pauline. And Pauline, and I'm sure she's gone now, I would be quite surprised if she wasn't. But anyway, she was an amputee with one wooden leg, and it actually was a wooden stump. And she was on this ward, and she was very helpful with us all. She helped us identifying. We were expected to know 150 patients in 3 days, especially giving out medications. So we had to know who people were. So she was just invaluable. And one day, I was giving out medication, and I was just new, very nervous, and one of the ladies decided she was going to take my medication tray from me. So there I was, trying to hold on to this tray with glasses of medication, and Pauline came along and saw that this lady was going to be very difficult. She bent down, took off her stump, and hit the woman and chased her away from my med cart. I never forgot that. That was an absolutely wonderful experience.
Ponoka at that time also, in addition to the drug therapies, was a leading progressive institution in different forms of psychotherapy, especially in terms of group psychotherapy. So the 1960s, by the time the 1960s rolled around, you have this combination of most patients being on some sort of pharmaceutical regimen in combination then with group psychotherapy, sometimes individual therapy, and all of this augmented by more interaction with townspeople and staff in non-hospital situations, community involvement, Ponoka citizens going to the hospital for celebrations, for sports days and other events, hospital staff and patients coming into town for annual events like the Ponoka Stampede, trips arranged by service clubs and other organizations in the community, assisting patients to be going not only on local camping trips to the Chain Lakes just to the east of Ponoka and other lakes in central Alberta, but also going to the ice capades in Edmonton or Calgary, to Banff and Jasper Park on various kinds of outings.
I don't know how I come to be selected, but I was selected to start a group of 6 men and 6 ladies, and we would be together during the day. They found us a place to call our home during the day, and much to the concern of some people, we even painted our unit, the Sunnyside unit.
And another time, we decided that we were going to have a beauty contest. So I lined up 7 nurses who were really pretty and put them in, well, not just nurses, I shouldn't say that. There was a housekeeper in it, there was a secretary, and they put on their formals and they walked up and down, and the patients bedded on on who was the woman for the beauty contest. It would never be allowed today. They would run me off the place for doing such a thing. But the town were wonderful. They gave us prizes for every one of those 7 women that competed. And then after that we had a dance. And one of the things about the dances was that Miss Kemp, our director of nursing, was very firm. If a patient asked you to dance, you never denied them.
One development that was put in place by our director, Mary Apt, and that was the move to nursing care plans or treatment care plans. They might have existed in some way before, but we were starting them in a really big way. And this is really looking at the person as a unique individual for sure, and the team working, or at least the nurses initiating care plans. And that was excellent, I think, on our unit, because that would include how can we help? How can we as nurses help this person while they're here? How can the social workers help? Recreation, and should they go to the garden gang, or what kind of therapy would be best? And that was she was early, I think, in this kind of a setting to introduce that, and I think it made a really good difference. Another thing I've heard that she said, because she was very forward-thinking in her nursing leadership, was that she never wanted to hear any staff member say, "That's not my job." If someone needs something, then you need to take responsibility to find out how we can meet that need for that person. And I think that was unique and special, I think, especially for this kind of a setting at the time.
There's more industrial forms of therapy in which local industries, and even outside of central Alberta, areas in the province where patients are given small remunerations for working in different kinds of apprenticeships associated with different businesses and industry. So you have all kinds of different therapies happening in the 1960s, and the thing that I've always found ironic is just when it seems that things are actually working reasonably well, the whole deinstitutionalization process settles in, and a lot of, I think, some of the best years that the hospital had were kind of stopped because so many patients were thought to be able to handle themselves on the pharmaceuticals alone, and they were returned to their families, to their communities, and oftentimes not with particularly good results.
I always felt that patients should get paid for the work they do in various departments, with the idea of, say, $60 a month. $30 would go for their hospitalization, their room and board, and the other money was for themselves. This idea was talked over with a couple of businessmen downtown. One was a banker and the other was a businessman and a head nurse, and we managed to arrange a meeting with the Minister of Health. And I was quite surprised at that, but he listened quite tentatively, and eventually we did, some patients did get paid as a token amount, you might say, for the service they had.
To the Christmas, the town of Ponoka would rent to us a movie. So we would have a movie on Friday night and then a movie on Saturday night for the people downtown. So the patient could come on Fridays and the staff and anybody else could come on Saturday night for a free movie. And then at Christmas time, the at home was a special time in which the staff and the patients came together for an evening. We had an evening of music. We had people from downtown would come up, choirs would come, and every staff member's child would get a little gift from the hospital, and so would the patient that was there. And we gave things like gloves and scarves and exercise books, little ballpoint pens, writing paper, things that they would find a good use for.
Once the institutions start shutting down, as they did in the latter part of the 20th century, there literally is no place for many of these people to go. Many of the people that I interviewed and talked with while writing and researching the book Hometown Asylum talked about these difficulties, and in the way that I've just tried very briefly and inadequately to describe some of the disappointment that many staff who were involved in some of the progressive treatments of the 1960s and the early 1970s, they felt extremely worried about some of the patients that were being returned to families, being returned to transition houses and other forms of non-institutional treatment.
I don't think an institution is where a person is meant to spend the rest of their life. I do not believe that at all. And I think from the moment that people are admitted, we should be thinking about, okay, where is this person going to go when he leaves or she leaves? What do they need to have happen for them to go there? That's what I really believe. On the other hand, when I find out the number of homeless people that we have and what percentage of those have a psychiatric diagnosis, there's a little piece of me that says, are they better off on the street or were they better off here? Of course, you know, I believe that an institution is not where people should live, but I don't think we made that transition very smooth. We started some of these what they called halfway houses, group homes, that kind of stuff. But we've got lots of people today falling through the cracks. They don't have a place to live, and they, you know, are just surviving by finding some food. But true to my core though, I don't believe people should be spending their life in an institution. They need to be in a home and being able to have enough to eat and are able to have good lives, happy lives in their community. But we're not there yet, and I'm just not sure if mental health got a back, kind of put on the back shelf or what. It just, we were pushed to give, we were pushing to get people out to the community. But I'm not sure we put the services and the resources in and the support services that people need in order to make that transition.
Should come back, but not in the perception of being institutionalized. I mean in the perception of caring, in the perception of community and home-like facilities that will offer permanent homes for people that are homeless and need supports in terms of sometimes they had dual diagnoses such as a mental illness or an addiction. And certainly the people that lived at Ponoka in the early days were safe. They received food, they received clothing, they received treatment and beds and so on, and were cared for and loved. And the hope was that they would get better. But people living on the streets live a very desperate form of life where they're surviving day to day and sometimes become addicted just to be able to live with themselves and get rid of the pain for a while. So the aggression and the violence and the crime continues on the streets. But if people can be supported in home-like situations where they know that this is their safe place, this is their permanent home, they have food and clothing, and many of them then can pay rent if they receive age payments from the government.
The transition, ideally, from the large institutions to community mental health facilities was supposed to have involved the building and the proper staffing of all kinds of halfway houses that would offer patients the opportunity of initially a great deal of support, and then as hopefully they progressed, less and less support until such time as they could be prepared to move into their communities, back into their family context. This gradual evolution was never really possible, not just in the case of the Ponoka Hospital, but in most deinstitutionalization contexts, not just in Canada, but in the United States and in Europe and so on and so forth. Instead of building all of these additional smaller facilities, many countries and many governments opted to forego the construction and the proper staffing of such places. And as a result, you effectively had all kinds of people with really no place to go. No place to go for therapy and no place to go for just basic human care. One of the things that was certainly true at the Alberta Hospital Ponoka and many other such institutions is that while despite all of the negative things that indeed did happen in the earlier days of the hospital, these becoming less and less prominent as they ought to have been, as they deserve to be less prominent, I should say, by the time that we were into the early 1970s. Now, these same patients who were in those kinds of treatment contexts are finding themselves without anywhere to go and without any kind of food or housing security. And toward the end of my book, I interviewed people who are concerned about this, and I state that I think that there may still be a place for some kind of, perhaps not large institutional, but institutional care that at least promises people some reliable housing and nourishment, as well as and allows them to lead a life of some degree of human dignity.
Alberta has been deemed as the only province that is committed to ending homelessness. So I think if there could be a number of community home-like situations, maybe in many communities in the province, it doesn't have to be in the big cities, but in smaller places where they can have the expert care and the focus on their therapy and getting better, and they know that this is permanent. The situations on the street of homelessness can alleviate itself in several years. I really believe that.
Oh, what the magic wand is for that. It would be wonderful for people to have a chronic, not to have the illness isn't wonderful, but to be diagnosed with a chronic mental illness and treated with the same respect if they had diabetes or another illness, that to be treated with respect. I hear stories sometimes about some of the psych patients going to emerge because the police take them or whatever, they're not sure what to do with them, and they're given a shot of something and sent back, no place to live, they're back on the street. It's we wouldn't do that to other patients that have got, say, I'm going to use diabetics. If they had a diabetic response, they would be trying to find them a place to, go and to recover. And we don't have that well established, I don't believe or perceive in Alberta at all.
On the admission unit, it was very clear that addictions was a big part of the complex needs of the people that we were serving and who were admitted to us. And it became clear to me that we needed a detox program in central Alberta, because people who needed detox had to go to Edmonton or Calgary, which can be really disruptive. They could have detoxed with us in the hospital, but that can be quite dangerous and again, pretty complex. So over time, now if I could just jump to the present, we do have a detox program in Red Deer and have since 2017. And that's just been such a bonus for keeping people closer to their homes and really helping people with, with addiction. And of course, we do have the formal help through Alberta Health Services, mental health services, and that's changed over time too. There's some outreach, but we could probably use even more outreach and more dedicated outreach for people with addiction and mental health issues. They often go together, not all the time, but we have our homeless shelter in town, and there's a lot of folks who really need more outreach. And that has, in the last few years, that has improved. We have some new programs that really are meeting people where they're at, as we say, on the street. But we need to continue that. We need even more. And of course, we need housing.
So I don't think we need to necessarily treat everybody with serious mental illness. Sometimes people do not respond to treatment, and that's just how life is. But I think that doesn't relieve us of a duty to care for people and provide the basic necessities of life for people. And I think we're failing miserably to do that. Not everyone on the street is an addict. Many mentally disturbed people find themselves in situations on the street where they may eventually become addicted, but certainly aren't addicts to begin with. They tend to be easily preyed upon. How this is supposed to be an advancement on what I described earlier as the last days of some of the best days of institutional care at hospitals like Ponoka's. I'll be darned if I can see much of a silver lining for many people in the current circumstance.